What happens when you remove the single most powerful man in the Middle East in one night? What happens when a regime built on divine authority wakes up without its divine center? And what happens when the world's oil arteries run through a region that just lost its political spine? Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today we break down what's shaping our world. Before we go any further, if you value sharp, a fact-based analysis that cuts through noise and gets to the structural truth, subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps this work independent and relentless. Now let's talk about what just happened. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is dead. Not retired, not sidelined, not weakened. Dead. Killed in coordinated U.S. and Israeli airstrikes that pulverized his central compound in Tehran. And this was not a headline designed to dominate a news cycle. This was a strike designed to alter the architecture of power in the Islamic Republic. Most Americans hear supreme leader and think ceremonial authority. That's a mistake. Under Iran's system of velayat-e-faqih, guardianship of the Islamic jurist, Khamenei was not a president. He was not a prime minister. He was the final authority over military strategy, intelligence operations, nuclear development, judiciary appointments, state broadcasting, and foreign policy doctrine. Every major lever of power ran upward to him. You remove that node, now you don't just create grief, you create a vacuum. And power vacuums are never empty for long. This was not the killing of a general. It was not the elimination of a field commander like Qasem Soleimani in 2020. Soleimani mattered. He was operational muscle. But Khamenei was the constitutional spine. He was the ideological engine and the institutional anchor. His signature could authorize escalation or restraint. Or his religious authority gave political decisions moral weight. His network of loyalists ensured alignment across military, intelligence, and economic arms of the state. When you decapitate that level of authority, three things happen simultaneously. First, institutional shock. Iran's power structure is centralized but layered. Khamenei balanced competing factions, the Revolutionary Guard, clerical hardliners, elected reformists, economic technocrats. He managed tension through authority. Without him, those tensions don't disappear. They intensify. Second, strategic recalculation. Israel and the United States didn't just eliminate a man, they sent a message. No office is untouchable. That alters deterrence models across the region. Hezbollah is recalculating. Gulf states are recalculating. China and Russia are recalculating. Third, economic tremors. Iran sits on the northern edge of the Strait of Hormuz, the artery through which roughly 1/5 of global oil flows. So when leadership stability in Tehran fractures, markets price risk. Oil doesn't just move on supply, it moves on fear. Insurance premiums on shipping rise. Airlines reroute, investors hedge, and that translates directly into American life. Gas prices at the pump, transportation costs, inflation pressure, Federal Reserve decision-making, election year politics. This is not abstract foreign policy. This is structural economics. Now here's the deeper layer most commentary is missing. Authoritarian systems are designed to survive leaders. Democracies rotate power regularly. Autocracies prepare for crisis quietly. There are deputies. There are contingency plans. There are pre-cleared successor networks. The Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, is not improvising this week. They have prepared for this scenario for years. The question is not whether Iran collapses tomorrow. The question is whether this strike weakens the regime permanently or forces it to consolidate more aggressively. History gives us cautionary examples. In 2003, removing Saddam Hussein fractured Iraq into sectarian conflict that lasted decades. That was regime removal without structural containment. In contrast, targeted strikes against specific leaders, if followed by controlled succession, can harden regimes rather than destroy them. So which model are we watching unfold? Look at what was struck alongside Khamenei. Senior military leadership, intelligence heads, nuclear research overseers. This was not a symbolic message. This was a disruption of continuity. It forces rapid replacement, and speed matters. The faster a regime fills gaps, the more stable it appears. The slower it moves, the more emboldened internal dissent becomes. Inside Iran, the reaction already reveals fracture. In Tehran, crowds mourned. In cities like Karaj and Doloran, statues fell. When that split matters, when grief and celebration exist in the same national moment, stability is fragile. But here is where strategic realism cuts through emotion. Revolutions do not succeed on celebration alone. They require coordination, leadership, and security force defection. The Revolutionary Guard still holds weapons, funding networks, and economic control. The IRGC controls major construction firms, energy logistics, telecommunications. This is not just a military organization. It is a financial empire, and empires do not surrender quietly. From Washington's perspective, the objective may not be regime change at all. Chaos in Iran would send oil above $120 per barrel overnight. That means inflation surges. That means pressure on the Federal Reserve. That means political backlash at home. Stability, even weakened stability, may be preferable to fragmentation. So we are watching something more subtle, a forced recalibration with the elimination of a central authority figure to weaken ideological rigidity and possibly alter negotiating leverage, especially around nuclear enrichment. But there's risk. When a system built on divine legitimacy loses its divinely positioned leader through foreign force, nationalism can override dissent. Even critics of the regime may recoil at external intervention. That rally around the flag effect is real. Yes, behavioral economics shows that populations under threat often consolidate rather than fragment. This is the razor's edge. Does Iran fracture, or does it harden? Does this create space for internal reform, or does it empower the most militant faction to assert control? For Americans watching from thousands of miles away, this moment feels distant. It isn't. Energy markets are global. Security alliances are interlinked. Military commitments ripple outward. And when a regime at the center of Middle East power politics loses its architect overnight, the consequences do not remain local. The next 90 days will determine whether this strike becomes the beginning of systemic collapse or the catalyst for a more disciplined, more security-driven Iran. And that is the uncomfortable truth. Removing a leader can destabilize a regime, but it can also strengthen its resolve. This isn't just about who died. It's about whether the Islamic Republic, built around one man's authority for nearly 4 decades, can now prove it is bigger than the man. Because if it can't, we are entering a far more volatile chapter. And if it can, the balance of power in the Middle East just shifted. Not toward collapse, but toward recalibrated confrontation. That's where we begin. Which Iranian officials were killed, and why each one mattered. Let's move past the headline and look at the structure. And because what happened in Tehran was not just the killing of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, it was the removal of an entire tier of Iran's command architecture: political, military, intelligence, and nuclear. And when you examine who was killed alongside him, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Start with General Abdul Rahim Musavi, Iran's Army Chief of Staff. His role was not symbolic. He was the bridge between doctrine and deployment. He ensured the regular armed forces remained aligned with the broader strategic vision dictated by the supreme leader. In systems like Iran's, cohesion between the conventional military and the Revolutionary Guard is not automatic. It is engineered. Musavi was part of that engineering. Removing him disrupts continuity in conventional command, especially during a moment when Iran must decide whether to escalate or recalibrate. Then there is General Aziz Nasirzadeh, the defense minister. Defense ministers in Western democracies often function as policy administrators. In Iran, the role is far more intertwined with procurement strategy, military-industrial networks, and sanctions evasion channels. Nasirzadeh was positioned at the intersection of defense contracts, domestic production, and foreign supply chains. His death is not just a battlefield loss. It creates friction in how Iran funds, builds, and replaces military capacity under sanctions pressure. Now consider Major General Mohammad Pakpour, commander of the Revolutionary Guard. This is where the strike becomes structurally bold. The IRGC is not merely a military force. It is an economic conglomerate. It controls construction firms, telecommunications stakes, energy infrastructure, and smuggling routes that bypass sanctions. Pakpor represented operational command and economic protection simultaneously, and eliminating him introduces both military uncertainty and financial recalibration within the Guard's network. Next is Ali Khamenei, top security advisor. His importance was subtle but critical. Khamenei operated in the gray space between diplomacy and intelligence. He was often the channel through which Iran communicated indirectly with adversaries and regional actors. Remove that layer, and informal back channels become unstable. In high-stakes environments, the informal communication prevents accidental war. Losing him increases miscalculation risk. Then we move into the intelligence and nuclear layer. Saleh Assadi, head of the Intelligence Directorate of the Qatam al-Anbiya Emergency Command, was central to wartime coordination. Qatam al-Anbiya functions as a command center during crisis scenarios. Assadi's removal weakens rapid response structure, the ability to synchronize missile defense, retaliatory planning, and cyber operations in real time. Mohammad Shirazi, head of the Military Bureau, was embedded in strategic oversight. His role connected leadership decisions to institutional execution. Bureau heads in authoritarian systems often ensure loyalty and discipline within ranks. Disruption at that level introduces internal trust issues during succession. Now we reach the nuclear dimension. Hossein Jabal Amalian, head of SPND, the Organization of Defensive Innovation and Research, was tied to advanced weapons research. ESPND has long been associated with Iran's scientific and defense innovation infrastructure. Removing its leader slows technical continuity. Research programs depend on institutional memory. Kill the leadership, and you slow momentum. Similarly, Reza Mozaffari Nia, former SPND head and former deputy defense minister, represented legacy continuity. He understood both historical program development and bureaucratic navigation. Eliminating both current and former leadership at SPND sends a message. Nuclear progression will not be insulated from kinetic consequences. Taken together, this was not random attrition. It was tiered targeting, political apex, conventional military leadership, Revolutionary Guard command, defense procurement oversight, intelligence coordination, nuclear research management. That pattern suggests intent beyond retaliation. It suggests strategic interruption. Sure, but here's where sober analysis matters. Authoritarian systems build redundancy. Deputies exist. Shadow leadership networks are prepared. Succession files are maintained. The Islamic Republic has survived war with Iraq, sanctions, cyber sabotage, and internal protest waves. It is not fragile in the conventional sense. The real variable is time. How quickly can replacements be installed? How effectively can messaging maintain internal discipline? And how confidently can the Revolutionary Guard project continuity? Markets, adversaries, and domestic critics all watch for hesitation. If replacements are swift and messaging unified, the system absorbs shock. If factional disputes surface publicly, instability compounds. And remember the financial dimension. The Revolutionary Guard's economic empire depends on predictability. Construction contracts, energy logistics, and cross-border trade networks require stable command signals. In any perception of fragmentation affects capital flows, even in sanctioned economies. Informal markets react to uncertainty just as formal ones do. This is why each name matters. Because leadership is not only about authority, it is about coordination. And when you remove multiple nodes of coordination simultaneously, you test whether the system was centralized around individuals or institutionalized beyond them. The coming weeks will reveal the answer. If command lines reform quickly, Iran hardens. If power struggles leak into public view, the pressure builds. And in geopolitics, pressure rarely stays contained. Was this a regime change operation or a controlled shock? Now we confront the central strategic question. Was this a regime change operation or a controlled shock designed to force recalibration? Because those are not the same objective, and the difference determines whether we are looking at managed instability or open-ended chaos. Or if this had been a regime change campaign in the traditional sense, we would see follow-through patterns already. Mass military deployments, coordinated support for opposition networks, explicit declarations that the Islamic Republic itself must fall. Instead, what we saw was a precise decapitation of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and senior command figures, without immediate ground invasion, without blanket bombardment of civilian infrastructure, and without overt declaration of occupation strategy. That matters. Regime change, historically, is expensive. Iraq in 2003 demonstrated that removing leadership without a functioning replacement architecture fractures the state. Power diffuses into militias, sectarian actors, and external proxies. Oil production collapses. Security vacuums invite insurgency. Reconstruction becomes generational. No serious strategist in Washington ignores that lesson. A controlled shock, by contrast, one aims to destabilize leverage without dismantling the state. It targets leadership nodes to disrupt strategic coherence while leaving institutional scaffolding intact. It is coercive adjustment, not total demolition. From a game theory perspective, this looks closer to coercive adjustment. Think in terms of bargaining power. Iran's nuclear enrichment capability has been the core leverage point in negotiations. As long as the system believed its leadership was insulated from direct kinetic consequences, escalation thresholds were theoretical. By striking the top tier, including figures connected to defense and nuclear infrastructure, the United States and Israel changed the payoff matrix. They signaled that continued strategic defiance carries personal risk at the highest level. That is not regime removal logic. That is deterrence recalibration logic. But here is where complexity enters. Decapitation strikes can produce unintended second-order effects. Authoritarian systems often respond to external attacks by consolidating power internally. The Revolutionary Guard may interpret this as proof that only hardened resistance ensures survival. Rather than moderating policy, the regime could double down. History shows that leaders under siege frequently narrow their advisory circles and intensify ideological discipline. There is also the economic dimension. Full regime collapse in Iran would detonate energy markets. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of global oil transport. Even a temporary closure would spike crude prices dramatically. American consumers would feel it within weeks. Inflation, already a politically sensitive issue, would surge. The Federal Reserve would face renewed pressure between price stability and growth preservation. Washington knows this. That makes it unlikely that decision-makers sought uncontrolled collapse. Instead, what we may be witnessing is calibrated instability, enough disruption to weaken centralized authority, enough shock to reshape internal power calculations, but not enough to dissolve the state entirely. However, strategy does not operate in a vacuum. Human psychology intervenes. Nationalism is powerful. When foreign forces eliminate a sovereign leader, even critics of that leader can recoil. This rally around the flag effect is well documented. Citizens who were skeptical yesterday may become defensive today. That dynamic complicates any assumption that leadership removal automatically accelerates domestic opposition. And then there is timing. If regime change were the objective, we would likely see immediate overt political pressure encouraging organized overthrow. Instead, what we observe is a more cautious rhetorical posture. Encouragement for the Iranian people to seize opportunity, yes, but not an operational blueprint for state dismantlement. So we are left with a narrow strategic corridor. The strike removed Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and senior command figures. It disrupted continuity. It introduced uncertainty, but it did not immediately obliterate state infrastructure. That suggests controlled shock, yet controlled shocks are unstable by nature. They rely on the assumption that the targeted system will respond predictably, that new leadership will prioritize survival over revenge, stability over escalation. If that assumption fails, the shock becomes escalation fuel. This is the risk frontier. Iran could interpret this moment as existential confrontation, prompting aggressive retaliation through proxies or direct confrontation. Alternatively, internal actors could view it as a moment to quietly rebalance strategy, recalibrate nuclear posture, and secure regime survival through pragmatic adjustments. In high-level strategic planning, the objective is often not to destroy the opponent outright. It is to alter their decision tree. The question now is whether Iran's decision tree narrows toward confrontation, or widens toward negotiation? And that answer will determine whether this moment becomes the first step toward de-escalation or the opening move in a more volatile phase of regional conflict. Horde-controlled shocks are powerful tools, but they are never fully controllable. The coming weeks will reveal whether this was a precise adjustment of the regional balance or the spark that ignites a broader confrontation neither side truly wants. Who is in charge? Right now, power does not disappear when a leader dies. It moves, it consolidates, it recalculates. Right now, Iran is operating under a three-person interim leadership council. Masoud Pezeshkian, Gholam Hossein Mohseni Ejei, Honeon Alireza Arafi. On paper, this is constitutional continuity. In practice, it is a test of who truly commands the machinery of the state. Masoud Pezeshkian, the reformist president, brings electoral legitimacy, but limited structural authority. In Iran's system, the presidency manages administration, budgets, and public-facing governance. It does not command the armed forces. It does not override the Revolutionary Guard. His presence on the council signals an attempt to project balance, or perhaps even calm. But reformist branding does not equal operational control. His influence will depend entirely on whether security institutions align with him or sideline him. Then there is Gholam Hossein Mohseni Ejei, the hardline judiciary chief. The judiciary in Iran is not merely a legal institution. It is an enforcement arm of ideological discipline. Ejei represents continuity of internal control. In moments of instability, judicial authority can expand rapidly, authorizing detentions, restricting protests, tightening surveillance. His inclusion on the council is not accidental. It ensures that the coercive legal framework remains intact while leadership transitions. Alireza Arafi, a member of the Guardian Council and linked to the Basijari paramilitary force, represents the theological and mobilization layer. The Guardian Council vets political eligibility. The Basij mobilizes street-level enforcement and ideological presence. Arafi's role bridges clerical authority with grassroots control. In crisis moments, that bridge becomes essential. Legitimacy must be defended not only in parliament, but in neighborhoods. But here is the hard truth. The interim council may not be where real power resides. The Revolutionary Guard remains the most decisive actor in the room. The IRGC controls missile forces, elite ground units, cyber capabilities, and vast economic assets. It oversees infrastructure projects, energy logistics, and networks that sustain sanctions resilience. When leadership transitions occur, the Guard's primary objective is survival of the system and preservation of its own financial architecture. In authoritarian systems, whoever controls force and funding controls trajectory. So while Pezeshkian, Mohseni Ejei, and Arafi provide constitutional continuity, the Revolutionary Guard provides operational continuity. If the Guard signals unity, the state projects stability. If fractures appear within its ranks, instability accelerates. The next indicators matter. Are protests spreading beyond symbolic acts? Are oil exports maintaining steady flow? Are retaliatory actions coordinated or chaotic? Are internal security forces cohesive? These are not abstract metrics. They are real-time diagnostics of regime durability. If oil shipments continue moving through the Strait of Hormuz without interruption, that signals centralized command. If security forces deploy rapidly and uniformly to contain unrest, that signals institutional alignment. If public messaging from the Council is disciplined and synchronized with military statements, that signals cohesion. But if conflicting statements emerge, if reformist rhetoric clashes with hardline enforcement, that signals factional tension. There is also a financial dimension that cannot be ignored. The Revolutionary Guard's economic footprint creates incentives for stability. Large infrastructure contracts, energy revenue streams, and trade networks depend on predictability. Prolonged chaos threatens those revenue channels. That makes the Guard structurally biased toward maintaining order, even if that order becomes more militarized. At the same time, succession moments create opportunity. Ambitious actors may seek to elevate their standing. Power vacuums invite competition. The interim council exists in a narrow corridor between projection of unity and containment of ambition. For Americans watching this unfold, it is critical to understand that leadership councils are often transitional theater. The deeper contest happens behind closed doors, within security briefings, clerical consultations, and guard command meetings. The Islamic Republic has mechanisms for succession. It has survived war, sanctions, assassination campaigns, and internal protest waves. The immediate question is not whether Iran collapses this week. It is whether the actors currently holding the reins can prevent fragmentation long enough to engineer a controlled transfer of authority. Power is being renegotiated in real time. The three-person council is the visible layer. The Revolutionary Guard is the structural layer, and the balance between them will determine whether this transition appears orderly or exposes deeper fractures within the system. Right now, control exists, but control in transitional moments is not permanent. It must be continuously asserted, and that assertion is already underway. The Assembly of Experts, the real decision engine. When Ayatollah Ali Khamenei died, headlines focused on the strike. But the real battlefield now is not in the skies over Tehran. It is inside a chamber of 88 clerics known as the Assembly of Experts. This body, often overlooked by Western audiences, is the constitutional engine of succession in the Islamic Republic. Under Iranian law, the Assembly of Experts must appoint the next supreme leader as soon as possible. On paper, it is a religious council charged with selecting the most qualified Islamic jurist. In reality, it is a political filter wrapped in theological language. And this is where the future of Iran will be decided. The Assembly's members are elected every 8 years. But there is a crucial qualifier. Candidates must first be approved by the Guardian Council. That vetting process eliminates ideological deviation long before voters see a ballot. The result is not a diverse parliament of competing visions. It is a curated circle of clerical insiders aligned with the system's core doctrine. So when Americans ask, who will choose Iran's next leader? The answer is not the public. It is not even the Interim Leadership Council of Masoud Pezeshkian, Anadi Gholam Hassan Mohseni AJ, and Alireza Arafi. It is this tightly screened assembly operating within the boundaries of regime preservation. But here is what makes this moment different. Succession in stable times is procedural. Succession after a targeted decapitation strike is existential. The assembly is not just selecting a theologian. It is selecting the guardian of a system under external pressure and internal fracture. And the next supreme leader must satisfy multiple constituencies simultaneously. The clerical establishment, the Revolutionary Guard, the security apparatus, and the economic networks that sustain the regime under sanctions. This is not a spiritual choice. It is a strategic calculation. Consider the variables. First, ideological continuity. The Islamic Republic was built on velayat-e faqih. The assembly cannot appoint someone perceived as weak in religious credentials without undermining the doctrine itself. Legitimacy still matters, especially in a system that claims divine justification. Second, security alignment. The Revolutionary Guard will not tolerate a leader who threatens its operational autonomy or economic footprint. The Guard controls assets across construction, energy, telecommunications, and trade logistics. Its loyalty is essential. Any candidate must be acceptable to this power bloc. Third, economic survival. Iran operates under heavy sanctions. Inflation, youth unemployment, and capital constraints strain domestic stability. The next supreme leader must either double down on resistance economics or cautiously recalibrate international posture. The assembly must weigh whether ideological rigidity or pragmatic flexibility better preserves regime longevity. Fourth, speed. Iranian law requires the selection to occur promptly. Prolonged vacancy invites uncertainty. Markets interpret delay as instability. Security forces interpret delay as hesitation. The assembly understands that time is not neutral. It is pressure. Historically, authoritarian succession moments are the most vulnerable periods in a regime's lifespan. Political science research consistently shows that transitions at the top increase coup risk, factional infighting, and elite bargaining conflicts. Even in highly controlled systems, ambition surfaces during transition. That means the assembly's deliberations are likely less harmonious than official statements suggest. Clerics may debate religious seniority, But behind those debates lie power alignments and future guarantees. Who protects the Revolutionary Guard's interests? Who reassures the clerical base? Who can navigate sanctions without signaling weakness? Who can command loyalty across security institutions fractured by recent losses? This is the decision matrix. And here is the strategic tension. If the assembly chooses a hardliner deeply embedded in the existing structure, the regime signals continuity and defiance. That could stabilize internal control but prolong confrontation externally. If it selects a more pragmatic figure, it risks internal backlash from security hardliners who fear dilution of ideological strength. The assembly of experts is often described as ceremonial. That description is dangerously simplistic. In this moment, it is the pivot point of the entire Islamic Republic. For Americans watching this unfold, understand this. Leadership transitions in authoritarian systems are not popularity contests. They are survival mechanisms. The assembly is not asking who inspires the public. It is asking who preserves the structure. And the answer it delivers will shape not just Iran's trajectory, but regional stability, nuclear posture, and the economic ripple effects that reach American households. The strike may have removed the face of the regime, but the assembly of experts will determine whether the body of that regime adapts or fractures under the weight of its own design. The clock is running, and every day without a definitive successor increases the stakes. Mojtaba Khamenei and the risk of dynastic power. In moments like this, succession is not just about theology. It is about bloodlines, networks, and control. And that brings us to one name that has hovered quietly around power for years. Mojtaba Khamenei. Mojtaba Khamenei is 56 years old. He is a cleric. He studied in Qom under religious conservatives. He has never held formal government office. On paper, that makes him an unlikely successor. But authoritarian systems are not built on resumes. They are built on proximity. For decades, Mojtaba operated as a gatekeeper to his father, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. In tightly centralized regimes, a proximity equals influence. Access to the supreme leader meant access to decision flow. Who got heard? Who got elevated? Who got sidelined? That kind of positioning builds networks, and networks are power. The critical question is not whether Mojtaba has formal credentials. The question is whether he has the backing of the Revolutionary Guard. Multiple reports over the years have described Mojtaba Khamenei as maintaining close ties with senior IRGC figures. In a system where the Guard controls both military force and substantial economic assets, that relationship is decisive. If Mojtaba is seen as someone who protects IRGC interests, his lack of official title becomes less relevant. Legitimacy can be constructed when force and funding align. But here is where the risk emerges. The Islamic Republic was founded as a revolutionary state, not a monarchy. It overthrew hereditary rule in 1979. Its ideological core rejects dynastic succession. If Mojtaba Khamenei ascends, even through constitutional process via the assembly of experts, the symbolism would be profound. It would signal a shift from revolutionary guardianship to familial continuity. That shift carries consequences. First, internal legitimacy. Clerical elites may question whether religious authority is being conflated with lineage. The doctrine of velayat-e faqih emphasizes qualification, not inheritance. If the perception forms that bloodline superseded merit, fractures within the clerical establishment could deepen. Second, public perception. Iran's younger generation has already demonstrated frustration with entrenched authority. A dynastic move may reinforce narratives that the system protects insiders rather than serving national interests. Even those who fear chaos may resent hereditary consolidation. Third, international interpretation. Markets respond to predictability. A Mojtaba-led transition could signal continuity and short-term stability. When investors often prefer known quantities, even authoritarian ones, to uncertainty. But geopolitical actors would interpret it as hardline persistence, not moderation. Now consider the financial dimension. The Revolutionary Guard's economic footprint depends on stable leadership that safeguards its assets. Mojtaba Khamenei, with deep familiarity inside the system, would likely preserve existing economic hierarchies. That continuity protects revenue streams, sanctions evasion networks, ARC and domestic contract pipelines. But dynastic systems often centralize even further. Concentrated authority reduces internal checks. Reduced internal checks increase long-term rigidity, and rigidity under sanctions pressure can amplify economic stagnation. There is also a strategic signaling issue. If Mojtaba ascends, adversaries may interpret it as defiance. A statement that the Islamic Republic will not reform under external pressure. Why, that could harden negotiating positions on nuclear enrichment and regional influence. Escalation risk could rise. At the same time, from the regime's perspective, elevating Mojtaba could project strength. It says the system remains intact. Leadership continuity is secured. The family remains embedded. There is no vacuum. The assembly of experts must weigh all of this. Not just theology, not just politics, but survival probability. Does Mojtaba Khamenei offer cohesion across clerical, military, and economic layers? Or does he introduce new legitimacy questions that weaken the ideological foundation? Dynastic transitions can stabilize regimes temporarily. Syria demonstrated that with Bashar al-Assad, but they also transform revolutionary movements into entrenched establishments. And entrenched establishments face different kinds of resistance. For Americans watching this unfold, understand the stakes. If Mojtaba Khamenei becomes supreme leader, when Iran's trajectory likely tilts toward continuity rather than recalibration, that means nuclear posture remains firm. Regional proxy networks remain active. Confrontation patterns persist. But it would also mean the Islamic Republic has crossed a psychological threshold from revolutionary guardianship to inherited authority. And once that threshold is crossed, systems rarely return to their original form. The choice is not simply about a man. It is about whether the Islamic Republic evolves into a clerical dynasty or reasserts its founding doctrine in a new direction. The decision will reveal whether Iran's future is anchored in bloodline or recalibration. The internal divide: mourning, celebration, and fear. The images coming out of Iran tell a story more powerful than any official statement. In Tehran, black-clad mourners gathered, some weeping openly, portraits of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei raised above their heads. When in other cities, Karaj, Izeh, Deloran, statues fell. Fires burned in traffic circles. Young voices shouted into the night. Celebration and grief unfolded simultaneously inside the same nation. This is not just emotion. It is structural fracture. Iran today is not unified in loyalty or rebellion. It is divided by generation, by geography, by economic pressure, and by fear. And fear may be the most decisive factor of all. For decades, the Islamic Republic built a layered social contract. It promised ideological continuity, resistance to foreign pressure, and national sovereignty. In exchange, it demanded political conformity. That contract has been strained by sanctions, inflation, youth unemployment, and repeated crackdowns, most notably during the Woman Life Freedom protests of 2022 and the deadly unrest earlier this year. Younger Iranians, especially in urban centers, have grown up under economic isolation. They are digitally connected to the world but physically constrained. Their frustration is not abstract. It is personal. Limited opportunity, restricted expression, economic stagnation. So when Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed, for some, it felt like the end of an era that never delivered what they were promised. But that is only one side of the divide. For others, Khamenei represented stability. However rigid, however confrontational, his leadership meant continuity. And in a region scarred by Iraq's collapse and Syria's civil war, chaos is not theoretical. It is visible history. Many Iranians remember what state failure looks like. They have seen it across their borders. Behavioral economics teaches us that humans are loss-averse. The fear of losing stability often outweighs the hope of gaining freedom. Even those dissatisfied with governance may prefer imperfect order to unpredictable collapse. This is the regime's strongest psychological asset right now: fear of the alternative. The Revolutionary Guard understands this dynamic. Stability messaging will emphasize sovereignty under threat. Foreign strikes will be framed not merely as military aggression, but as an attack on national dignity. Nationalism can temporarily override ideological dissent, but that does not erase the generational fracture. Urban youth networks remain active. Grievances over economic inequality and political restriction persist. The removal of the supreme leader does not remove systemic frustration. It simply reshuffles the emotional landscape. The key question is whether celebration can transform into coordination. Spontaneous joy and courage, or isé, signals discontent, but revolutions require organization, leadership, and security force defections. As long as the Revolutionary Guard and Basij remain cohesive, a widespread uprising faces structural barriers. At the same time, visible division weakens perceived legitimacy. Authoritarian systems rely on projection of unity. When images of mourning and statue toppling circulate simultaneously, the illusion of consensus fractures. There is also an economic undercurrent here. Sanctions pressure and inflation have disproportionately affected lower and middle classes. When economic frustration aligns with political anger, unrest becomes more combustible. But if uncertainty threatens oil exports or employment pipelines, risk aversion increases. So we are watching a psychological contest. Can the regime channel grief into consolidation? Can dissenters channel celebration into organized pressure? Or will fear of chaos suppress momentum? This moment is emotionally charged, but strategic outcomes depend on structure, not sentiment. If protests expand geographically and security responses hesitate, instability deepens. If enforcement remains swift and centralized, fear may outpace rebellion. For Americans observing from a distance, understand this. Social fracture inside Iran directly influences external behavior. A regime under internal threat may escalate outward to unify domestically. Alternatively, it may focus inward, prioritizing internal control over regional confrontation. The divide we see on the streets is not just about mourning or celebration. It is about competing visions of Iran's future. Resistance and continuity versus recalibration and reform. But beneath those visions lies a common anxiety. What comes next? And until that question feels safer than the present, fear will remain the regime's most powerful stabilizer. The internal divide is real. The emotional volatility is real. But whether that volatility becomes transformation or suppression depends on who moves faster, organized dissent or disciplined security. High history shows that societies at crossroads rarely remain neutral. The direction Iran chooses will not be determined by emotion alone. It will be determined by whether division translates into sustained pressure or dissolves under the weight of uncertainty. The global chessboard, China, Russia, and the energy markets. The moment Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed, the shock wave did not stop at Iran's borders. It moved east to Beijing, north to Moscow, and straight into the arteries of the global energy system. This is not just a Middle Eastern event, it is a geopolitical stress test. Start with China. Foreign Minister Wang Yi wasted no time condemning the strike as unacceptable and calling for an immediate ceasefire. That language was not emotional, it was calculated. Beijing frames events like this through sovereignty doctrine. The message is simple. External force used to eliminate a sovereign leader sets a precedent. When precedents matter in a world where Taiwan remains a flashpoint, China is Iran's largest oil customer under sanctions. Discounted Iranian crude feeds Chinese refineries and supports domestic growth targets. Instability in Tehran is not ideological for Beijing. It is economic. Every disruption risk to the Strait of Hormuz threatens energy security, and energy security underpins China's manufacturing dominance. But there's more. China positions itself as a stabilizing counterweight to American military activism. By condemning the strike and invoking international norms, Wang Yi reinforces a narrative. Washington destabilizes. Beijing preserves order. That messaging resonates across parts of the global South. It strengthens China's diplomatic leverage without firing a shot. Now look at Russia. Moscow's alignment with Tehran is strategic. Iran supplies drones and military cooperation in broader geopolitical conflicts, when sanctions have pushed both nations toward parallel financial systems and trade corridors. Russia benefits from any event that complicates American influence in the Middle East. But Moscow also understands volatility risk. If Iran destabilizes severely, Oil prices spike. In the short term, that benefits Russian energy revenues. Higher crude prices mean more fiscal breathing room for the Kremlin. However, an uncontrolled escalation, especially if it leads to regional war, could fracture fragile energy trade networks. So Russia walks a familiar line: condemn the strike, support sovereignty rhetoric, but avoid entanglement that demands direct confrontation. Now step back and examine the energy markets. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 1/5 of global oil supply. Even the perception of disruption sends futures markets into defensive positioning. Traders do not wait for closure. They price probability. Insurance premiums for tankers rise when missile retaliation is plausible. Shipping routes adjust. Liquefied natural gas shipments reroute. Airlines divert flight paths away from contested airspace. These micro-adjustments add cost, and cost compounds. In a world already sensitive to inflation, energy volatility is politically explosive. For American households, that means potential pressure at the pump. It means transportation costs feeding into food prices. It means businesses recalculating supply chains. And it means the Federal Reserve monitoring inflation expectations with renewed caution. This is the systemic dimension. Geopolitical instability feeds into commodity volatility. Commodity volatility feeds into inflation. Inflation feeds into interest rate decisions. Interest rates feed into housing markets, investment flows, and consumer confidence. All of it interconnected. China and Russia understand this chain reaction. So does Washington. And there is another layer often missed. If Iran feels cornered internally, it may leverage external pressure points, including maritime routes, to regain bargaining power. Even limited harassment in the Strait of Hormuz can generate disproportionate market impact. That creates leverage without full-scale war. China's condemnation and evacuation advisories signal that Beijing takes escalation risks seriously. You do not tell your citizens to prepare exit routes unless you assess credible instability. And here lies the strategic tension. The United States and Israel have demonstrated reach. China and Russia have signaled rhetorical opposition. Energy markets are bracing for volatility. The Revolutionary Guard remains intact. This is multipolar brinkmanship. No single actor controls escalation. Each is calculating cost thresholds. If Iran stabilizes quickly, markets calm. Oil retraces. Inflation pressure moderates. Diplomatic channels reopen. If retaliation intensifies and maritime disruption grows, energy prices surge. Political pressure in Washington increases. Global supply chains strain. This is not theoretical. We have seen versions of it before. The difference now is the level of leadership disruption inside Iran combined with heightened global polarization. China wants stability without American dominance. Russia wants leverage without direct entanglement. The United States wants deterrence without oil shock. Those objectives do not align cleanly, so the global chessboard is active. Every statement from Wang Yi, every signal from Moscow, every tanker rerouting in the Gulf feeds into a broader recalculation of power. And for Americans, the takeaway is clear. What happens in Tehran does not stay in Tehran. Energy flows are global. Markets are global. Inflation is global. This is not just a regional transition. It is a pressure test for the entire international system. And the next move will not be decided by rhetoric alone. It will be decided by whether stability reasserts itself or whether strategic actors push this moment further than they intend. Who will be Iran's new leader and what it means for America? Who becomes Iran's next supreme leader will not just shape Tehran. It will shape oil markets, nuclear timelines, proxy conflicts, and the strategic posture of the United States for the next decade. This is not a ceremonial transition. It is a structural pivot. The Assembly of Experts now faces a narrow set of realistic pathways. Strip away speculation, and 3 scenarios dominate the board. First, hardliner continuity. The Assembly could select a senior cleric deeply aligned with the existing security establishment. Someone ideologically firm, institutionally loyal, and fully acceptable to the Revolutionary Guard. Whilst this would signal defiance, it would reassure internal power centers that nothing fundamental is changing. It would also communicate externally that nuclear enrichment, regional proxy networks, and resistance doctrine remain intact. For America, that scenario means continuity of tension. Negotiations over enrichment would remain constrained. Sanctions pressure would continue. Deterrence management would stay delicate. Markets would likely interpret this as short-term stability, but long-term confrontation. Second, the dynastic path. Mojtaba Khamenei. If the assembly of experts elevates him, the signal would be powerful. It would say that proximity to Ayatollah Ali Khamenei translates into succession legitimacy. The Revolutionary Guard, if aligned with that choice, would prioritize system preservation over doctrinal purity. For Washington, in a Mojtaba-led Iran would likely maintain ideological posture while consolidating internally. Nuclear policy would not soften quickly. Regional influence operations would persist. But the regime might focus heavily on domestic stabilization before engaging in overt escalation. Markets would interpret this as continuity with controlled consolidation. Third, a hybrid model, a clerical figurehead with expanded Revolutionary Guard dominance behind the scenes. This may be the most plausible outcome. The assembly selects a religious authority acceptable to clerical circles, while operational control shifts incrementally toward the Guard. In this model, Iran becomes more securitized, less ideologically theatrical, and more strategically disciplined. For the United States, that scenario creates a paradox. A more IRGC-influenced system may be more predictable in its cost-benefit calculations, yet more assertive in defending strategic interests. Nuclear posture could become more transactional. A retaliation calculus could become colder, not hotter. Now consider the least predictable scenario, fragmentation. If elite consensus fractures, succession drags on, and factional infighting leaks into public view, instability rises. That instability increases the risk of external escalation, internal unrest, and energy market volatility. For Americans, the stakes are immediate and tangible. Energy security remains central. Even modest instability around the Strait of Hormuz can spike crude prices. Higher oil means higher transportation costs. Higher transportation costs mean renewed inflation pressure. And inflation feeds directly into Federal Reserve rate decisions, housing affordability, and job market confidence. Then there is the nuclear dimension. Leadership determines posture. A successor who views enrichment as non-negotiable identity will accelerate strategic ambiguity. A successor who prioritizes economic stabilization may consider tactical compromise. The difference affects not only Israeli security calculations, but American military commitments across the region. The United States does not operate in isolation. China watches oil stability. Russia watches American posture. Gulf states watch regime durability. Every actor recalibrates based on who emerges in Tehran. But here is the deeper strategic truth. Leadership change in authoritarian systems often produces overcorrection. A new supreme leader may feel compelled to prove strength. That can mean sharper rhetoric, controlled retaliation, or assertive symbolic gestures. Washington must anticipate that instinct. At the same time, internal economic strain remains real inside Iran. Sanctions, inflation, and demographic pressure do not disappear with a new appointment. Over time, survival instincts often drive recalibration more than ideology does. So what should Americans watch? Watch oil export volumes. Watch statements from the Revolutionary Guard. Watch the speed and unity of the Assembly of Experts' decision. Watch whether nuclear inspectors gain or lose access. These are signals of direction. This moment is not just about succession, it is about trajectory. If Iran selects a leader who consolidates without escalating, the region enters a tense but manageable phase. If succession amplifies hardline competition or invites miscalculation, volatility rises sharply. For the United States, the objective remains clear: deter escalation, preserve energy stability, and avoid entanglement that drags American resources into prolonged conflict. Whoever becomes Iran's next supreme leader inherits a system under pressure, economically constrained, politically divided, strategically challenged. The question is whether that leader chooses rigidity or recalibration. And for America, the difference between those two choices will shape not just foreign policy headlines, but the cost of fuel, the direction of markets, and the balance of power in one of the most volatile regions on Earth. This transition is historic, but history does not move on emotion. It moves on structure, incentives, and decisions made in rooms the public never sees. The next supreme leader will determine whether Iran hardens or adapts, and the consequences will not stop at its borders.